Richard Vale thought he had found his forever love when he met the stunning Alina Cruz on a dating app. But what began as a dream marriage between a rich Miami groom and a beautiful young woman soon turned into a deadly honeymoon in Switzerland where love, money, and betrayal collided in the coldest way imaginable. Richard Vale had lived most of his life surrounded by luxury, yet nothing filled the emptiness that lingered inside him. At 61, he was one of Miami's most recognizable figures, a self-made real estate mogul who had turned a small family inheritance into a vast empire of high-rise condos and beachfront resorts. His name was associated with wealth, charity, and influence. He attended exclusive galas, donated to hospitals, and kept his image spotless in public. But behind the charm and confidence was a man haunted by loneliness. 2 failed marriages, estranged friends, and long quiet evenings in his glass-walled penthouse had left him craving companionship. It was on one of those restless nights that Richard downloaded a dating app. He scrolled through countless profiles, some too young, some too superficial, until one caught his attention. Her name was Alina Cruz. She was breathtaking in every photo, tall, graceful, with dark hair that framed her delicate face, and eyes that seemed to hide both warmth and mystery. Her profile said she was a traveler seeking authentic love, a phrase that struck him as genuine. Among the endless stream of pretenders, he sent her a message that night, and by morning she had replied. Their conversations were light at first, filled with polite questions and compliments, but soon they deepened. Alina spoke about her love of art and her dream to open a gallery someday. She said she admired older men for their wisdom and stability. Richard found himself checking his phone constantly, waiting for her replies. Within weeks, they were speaking daily. She made him feel young again, excited to wake up each morning. He began sending her gifts, flowers, jewelry, even plane tickets for weekend getaways. When they met in person, it felt like a dream. She arrived at a Miami restaurant in a fitted white dress, her perfume soft but unforgettable. Richard was instantly smitten. She listened to him with full attention, laughed at his stories, and spoke with an accent he couldn't quite place. Everything about her was effortless, graceful, and alluring. Friends warned him that she seemed too perfect, but he brushed off their doubts. For the first time in years, someone made him feel alive. Their romance became the talk of Miami's elite. The sight of the powerful businessman and his striking young partner drew whispers wherever they went. Within 6 months, Richard proposed during a private yacht dinner under the stars. Alina accepted with tears in her eyes, and soon after, wedding plans began. The ceremony took place at Richard's oceanfront estate, a lavish affair with hundreds of guests, live music, and champagne flowing all night. Despite the grandeur, some noticed subtle unease in Richard's demeanor. He seemed overly eager to please her, almost fearful of losing her affection. Alina, meanwhile, appeared perfectly composed, floating through the event like a queen among admirers. She had everything she wanted: wealth, power, and the trust of a man too blinded by love to see what hid beneath her smile. When the couple announced their honeymoon destinations, Switzerland, everyone wished them well. But behind Alina's polished elegance was a plan already in motion, one that would turn the dream vacation into a deadly journey from which only one of them would return. The honeymoon began in Zurich, where snow fell in soft, silent layers over cobbled streets and glassy lakes. Richard booked the finest hotels, hired private drivers, and reserved tables at Michelin-starred restaurants. He wanted everything to be perfect, a final gesture to prove that his love for Alina was boundless. To him, this was the trip that would seal their future together. To her, it was an opportunity, one she had been preparing for since the first time she heard his name. Alina played her part flawlessly. She posted photos of their lavish breakfasts, mountain views, and shopping sprees in luxury boutiques. Her social media was filled with admiration from friends and followers who saw her as a woman who had finally found her fairy tale. Richard didn't realize that behind every smile she posted was calculation. Every photo was evidence for a future story she planned to tell, a digital record that would frame her as the devoted wife, and him as the man who adored her beyond reason. Their next stop was Lucerne, where the snow-covered Alps shimmered under the winter sun. They stayed in a secluded chalet overlooking a frozen lake. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. Richard loved it: the crackling fireplace, the isolation, the way the world seemed to slow down. He wanted time to stop. Alina, however, seemed restless. She spent long hours on her phone, often stepping outside to take calls she claimed were from family. When Richard asked about them, she brushed it off with a soft smile that disarmed every question. As the days passed, Richard noticed her behavior changing in subtle ways. She grew distant, less affectionate, and often irritated by small things. She criticized his clothes, the restaurants he chose, even the way he pronounced Swiss names. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just post-wedding stress. He even gave her his credit card to buy whatever she wanted, hoping it would bring back her warmth. She accepted it without hesitation, and spent thousands on jewelry and designer coats within days. One evening, they took a cable car ride up Mount Pilatus. The view was breathtaking, with the city lights twinkling below and the stars stretching endlessly above. Richard held her gloved hand, whispering about how lucky he felt. Alina stood still, her gaze fixed on the dark forest below. She asked him questions about his business, his bank accounts, and his will-pretending curiosity, though her tone carried a strange intensity. He laughed it off, but something in her eyes made him uneasy. That night, after they returned to the chalet, Alina scrolled through her phone long past midnight. On the screen was a message thread with someone saved as A. The last message read, "He has no clue. Everything's ready." She locked the phone and placed it face down beside her. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, and snow began to fall harder. Inside, Richard slept soundly beside the woman he believed was his forever love, unaware that his life was already unraveling, and that his wealth had made him more vulnerable than he had ever imagined. The following morning, the cold seemed sharper, the air heavier. Richard woke to find Alina already dressed, sipping coffee by the window. She looked distant, her eyes fixed on the snow-covered valley below. When he asked about breakfast, she simply nodded, distracted. Something about her calmness unsettled him. He couldn't explain why, but there was a strange tension lingering between them, one that hadn't been there before. Later that day, they traveled to Interlaken, a breathtaking town nestled between two lakes. Richard had planned a private helicopter tour over the Swiss Alps, something he thought would rekindle the romance that had started to fade. Alina agreed but seemed uninterested, scrolling through her phone as he excitedly described the route. She wore a long red coat and dark sunglasses, her face unreadable. As they soared above the icy peaks, Richard tried to hold her hand, but she kept her arms crossed. The pilot, noticing the silence, tried to lighten the mood with small talk, but even he could sense the chill between the couple. When they landed, Alina suddenly brightened, insisting on visiting a nearby jewelry boutique. She spent hours there, choosing expensive diamond earrings and a necklace, all paid for by Richard without question. That night, back in their hotel, Richard received an email alert from his bank. There had been multiple large withdrawals from his joint account purchases he hadn't approved. His first instinct was confusion, then disbelief. When he asked Alina about it, she told him he must have forgotten granting her permission. Her tone was so smooth, so confident, that he doubted his own memory for a moment. Still, unease began to sink in. The next morning, he called his financial advisor in secret, asking for a review of his accounts. The advisor confirmed unusual activity transfers to a foreign account under a name he didn't recognize. Panic crept in. When he confronted Alina again, she dismissed his concerns and packed her suitcase, claiming she needed space. She stormed out of the room, leaving him staring at the door in shock. Hours passed before she returned, smiling as if nothing had happened. She handed him a glass of wine, saying she wanted to forget the argument and start fresh. Relieved, Richard accepted it, unaware that the wine had been tampered with. Minutes later, his head began to spin. The room blurred, and his body felt heavy. Alina watched him slump back into the chair, his breathing uneven, her expression unreadable. When he woke the next morning, he was disoriented but alive. The empty wine glass was gone, as was Alina. On the table lay a note written in her neat handwriting, saying she needed time to think about their future. His phone buzzed with another bank notification, another transfer, this time larger than before. Outside, the snowstorm had intensified, blanketing the town in silence. Richard realized, with a slow and dreadful clarity, that the woman he had married wasn't the one he thought she was. The honeymoon was over, and the danger he faced was no longer emotional, it was deadly. Richard searched the hotel lobby, the streets, and every nearby cafe, but Alina had vanished without a trace. Her phone went straight to voicemail, and none of the hotel staff remembered seeing her leave. Panic turned to dread as he realized how little he actually knew about her. She had no close friends he could call, no family she had ever introduced, and the details she'd shared about her past now seemed vague, almost rehearsed. Every photo, every story she'd told suddenly felt like a well-crafted performance. By evening, his exhaustion gave way to confusion. He returned to the room, only to find her suitcase gone and his laptop missing. His financial accounts were locked, his credit cards declined. The reality hit him like a blow. She had drained him. Everything he owned that could be reached online was now in her control. He called his bank, but their responses were slow and bureaucratic. While they investigated, Alina was already several steps ahead. The next day, Richard went to the local police in Interlaken to file a report. The language barrier made it difficult to explain what had happened. The officers took notes politely, but seemed skeptical. They treated it as a domestic dispute, advising him to contact authorities in the United States. Frustrated, he returned to the hotel, desperate to find any clue. He went through her remaining belongings: a perfume bottle, a silk scarf, and a Swiss train ticket dated for that morning. She was heading toward Geneva. Determined to confront her, Richard boarded the next train. The journey felt endless, each passing mountain a reminder of his growing despair. He replayed every moment they'd shared, trying to pinpoint when her affection had shifted into deception. Somewhere between Miami and Switzerland, love had turned into calculation, and he had been too blinded by desire to see it. When he arrived in Geneva, the trail went cold. None of the luxury hotels had her name on record. He wandered through the crowded city streets, hoping for a glimpse of her dark hair or familiar scent. Just when he thought he'd lost her completely, he he noticed a news broadcast playing on a television inside a small cafe. The headline froze him in place. An unidentified woman matching Alina's description had been spotted entering a bank under a different name, accompanied by an unknown man. The man's face was partially hidden, but his build was unmistakable. Richard had seen him once before, months earlier in Miami, when Alina had claimed he was just a friend. Realization hit hard. She hadn't acted alone. The messages he'd glimpsed on her phone, the coded references, all led to this moment. He rushed to the bank, but by the time he arrived, both were gone. The teller confirmed 2 individuals had withdrawn a large sum and taken a taxi toward the mountains. The police were notified, but hours passed before any response came. As night fell, Richard checked into a small inn near Lake Geneva. The weight of betrayal and fear pressed on him. He locked the door and sat by the window, staring at the icy water outside. Somewhere in the darkness, Alina was out there with his money, his trust, and perhaps even plans for something far worse. The morning brought a gray stillness to Geneva. The snow had stopped, but the clouds hung low over the city, pressing down like a warning. Richard hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elena's face, her calm, knowing smile. The way she had always looked slightly past him, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. He checked his phone for updates from the police, but there were none. To them, it was a matter of fraud, not urgency. To him, it was something far darker. He spent hours retracing her last known steps. The bank's security footage confirmed that Elena and the unknown man had taken a black taxi into the Alps region. Richard rented a car and followed the route north toward Montreux, the snow-covered road twisting between cliffs and frozen lakes. The closer he got to the mountains, the more he felt a gnawing certainty that he was being pulled towards something inevitable. By sunset, he reached a small mountain village. The streets were empty except for a few locals closing their shops. He showed Elena's picture to anyone who would listen, but most shook their heads. Finally, an old innkeeper remembered seeing a woman who matched her description checking in 2 nights ago with a younger man who paid in cash. They had left early that morning, heading toward a nearby lodge known for its isolation and expensive clientele. Richard drove there immediately, his hands tight on the steering wheel. Snow began falling again, heavy and relentless, coating the windshield in white. When he finally arrived, the lodge looked almost abandoned, a handful of cars in the lot, dim lights flickering through frosted windows. He entered the lobby, heart pounding. The receptionist hesitated when he mentioned the names, then quietly nodded toward the upper floor. He climbed the wooden stairs slowly, the silence so complete he could hear his own breathing. The hallway smelled faintly of perfumers. At the end of the corridor, he saw the door slightly ajar. He pushed it open and froze. Inside, the room was empty, but a faint sound came from the adjoining balcony. He stepped closer, and there she was, Lena, standing in the cold, wrapped in a fur coat, her hair blowing in the wind. The man beside her turned, startled, his face pale. For a moment, no one moved. Richard's thoughts blurred between anger and heartbreak. He saw his life, his love, his fortune all in front of him, stolen and twisted into a cruel game. The man stepped forward, trying to speak, but Richard barely heard him. His focus was on Alina, who looked at him not with fear, but pity. It was the same expression she'd worn the first time they met, calm, practiced, untouchable, then chaos. The man reached into his coat, pulling something small and metallic. Richard lunged before he could react, and the two crashed into the balcony railing. A struggle erupted, desperate and clumsy. Alina screamed, but made no move to stop them. The railing cracked under their weight, splintering in the cold air. In a single, terrible instant, both men lost balance. The world turned upside down as Richard felt the icy wind rush past his face. Then, darkness. When he opened his eyes, he was lying in the snow below, pain surging through his body. The other man was motionless beside him, half buried in the white. Richard tried to move, but his strength was fading. Above, Alina leaned over the broken balcony, her figure outlined against the gray sky. For a second, it seemed like she might call for help. Instead, she turned away, closing the door behind her. It took nearly 12 hours for the authorities to find them after a guest reported a noise. The man was declared dead at the scene. Richard was barely alive, his ribs shattered, his leg broken. He was flown to a hospital in Bern, where he drifted in and out of consciousness. Days later, when he finally awoke, police officers stood by his bedside. They told him Alina had disappeared. Every account under her name had been closed, every trail erased. She had vanished into the world with millions of dollars, Hunter's death on her conscience. Months passed before Richard was well enough to return to Miami. He sold most of his properties, withdrew from public life, and spoke rarely of what happened. Investigators believed Alina had changed her identity and fled to another country, possibly in South America. She was never caught. In the end, Richard's story became another cautionary tale whispered among the wealthy. A man who had everything, brought down not by violence alone, but by love misplaced in the wrong hands. Somewhere across the ocean, Alina lived freely, her face hidden behind a new name, her past erased, and in quiet moments, when the ocean breeze swept through his empty penthouse, Richard still wondered if she ever thought of him not as her victim, but as the man who had loved her enough to risk everything, even his life.